Okay. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see this room so crowded. Welcome, everyone. And I really want to, two kinds of welcome. First, specifically and wholeheartedly welcome our guests tonight who are here for this year's open house for accepted students. Congratulations. I've said this a couple of times today. It was a particularly difficult year to get in, so bravo to you. And I hope you have enjoyed your time with us today. And for the people who are joining us via Zoom because you couldn't make it to the open house, equal congratulations to you. It's an equal pleasure to welcome everyone to the annual David W. Roth and Robert H. Simmons Memorial Lecture, which is going to be given this evening by Kathryn Yusoff. The lecture was established in the year 2000 through a generous gift from W. Mason Smith III, who received his Master of Architecture from Yale in 1965, in honor of his two classmates, the aforementioned David W. Roth and Robert H. Simmons. And it was the intention that the speaker not be an architect. The gift says this is to reinforce the broad goals of the profession, which to my mind is that we need to be well-educated people. Previous lecturers in this series include the sociologist Saskia Sassen, the author Elaine Scarry, the philosopher Karsten Harries, the film director Liam Young, and the new media scholar Wendy Chun. So it's a real pleasure to add Kathryn Yusoff to that list. Professor Yusoff is a geographer and holds this incredibly great title, Professor of Unhuman Geography at Queen Mary University in London. She received her BA from Northumbria University, her MA from Bath Spa University, and her PhD from the Royal Holloway University of London. Her work focuses on dynamic Earth events such as biodiversity loss and extinction and abrupt climate change, and her research draws on earth science, critical human geography, and feminist philosophy. She serves on the editorial boards of the Geographical Journal, the writing group of the European Science Foundation, and has had articles published in Technosphere, Social Text, Feminist Review, and Theory, Culture, and Society, among many, many other scholarly journals and collections. Her most recent book, entitled A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, was published by the University of Minnesota Press. Please join me in welcoming Kathryn Yusoff for her lecture entitled Broken Earths and Built Earths, Architectures at an Inhuman Impasse.
Thank you so much, and it's amazing to see such a packed space. I feel very honored to be here. And I just want to start with some thanks to the MED working group, Juliana, Samaja, Emily, Alberto, Austin, Bruno, and to Keller Eastling for this invitation. It's a real joy to step outside the world of geography and to kind of be in dialogue and be in an extended dialogue with architecture. And thank you for the exemplary logistics that enable my smooth passage here yesterday evening from Richard DeFuni. So I want to start by thinking about the question of broken earth in the context of built earths. So I start from this premise that the questions of scale and participation that are newly raised in the Anthropocene and its epoch of geologic change give a new kind of understanding of what we might comprehend as architecture. So here we might think of architecture understood as a geographic practice of coherences towards or contra to the praxis of colonial earth that built this new geologic state. So here, what I'm suggesting is that the Anthropocene is a manifestation of colonial afterlives and its material practices and its discourses of materialisms. So where does architecture begin and where does it end if the earth has been geoengineered through colonial materialisms and its processes of a made earth? So if we see the Anthropocene as a particular kind of geosocial arrangement of the praxis of colonialism and its engagement with the earth, and the material subjugation of the racialized poor and indigenous communities, what is the cost of architectural forms that continue to propagate the myth of architecture as isolated from the mind and the memory of life worlds and prior materialisms that were held in place? So architecture's approach within modernity in the genre of natural resources has often been to produce a language of materiality that is independent of its former earth attachments and location. Indeed, architecture is the genre in which the transformation of place-based material worlds becomes one in which place is created anew, often with materials severed from the life worlds that have sustained them elsewhere. So territory is no longer a destination or an accomplishment of conquest, but a property of the inhuman dimensions of matter in the Anthropocene. The radioactive waste soil and Portland cement is a classic, apparently, stage 11 Anthropocene fossil, according to new classifications in mineralogy, at a time when mineral diversity is experiencing this punctuation event owing to the pervasiveness of what's called near-surface effects of human industrial society. So this talk consists of two precepts of broken earth and built earth in the Anthropocene, and I want to lead on to a proposition of an impasse as a way to bridge these differentiated or rifted and what I think of as raced earths that the talk focuses on. So the first kind of precept that I want to introduce is the idea of a broken earth as a rifted earth, where spatialities are enacted and maintained through the proposition of race. So the Anthropocene proclaims a sudden concern with exposure of environmental harm, but it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly imported to black and brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernity, and capitalism, which is to think colonialism as a world-ending iterative practice. It began with the end of worlds. The ending of indigenous and black and brown life worlds was predicated on a version of progress that was sutured to a very particular kind of idea of materialism that continues to rely on the destruction of environments, livelihoods, and communities for its realization and valuation, so through spatial processes of devaluation. So we might say that we're at an inhuman impasse, as Earth is understood both through the lens of race and through the lens of Earth as a kind of occupied subject position. So the inhuman performs this doubling of race and Earth. So this is the praxis of a rifted Earth and a hidden Earth that produces its shadow geologies. And we can think here in the kind of organization of subject matter as agental, as organic, as opposed to subjectification as inhuman, as void matter, inorganic and dead. And the grammar of the inhuman is that which passes the stability of the object of property for extraction and valuation. And this was continuous over invaded peoples and racialized peoples. So we can think about colonial Earth as productive of other Earths, of a shadow geology that maintained a very particular idea of the Earth and of planetarity. So there is an imperative to move away from this one world vision into a rifted vision of the dimensionality of space and its racial gravities, what might be understood as a geophysics of race. So the second precept that I want to introduce is that built Earths can be architectures of the future that have a restorative and reparative engagement with the past. They can remediate and refuse infrastructures of colonial renewal. And this really kind of positions architecture at a kind of crossroads in terms of its organization of planetary states. So Anthropocene Earths, as I've said, are made through urban strata. Cities have been geologic projects all along, harnessing particular formations of geopower that use geologic materials to substantiate and narrativize the urban. So we can think about architecture as constitutively geologic and involved in geologic practices. The core of this process is the rendering of the inhuman as a social geology. So we're in a state now where geology has been socialized and the human, in turn, has been geologized. So at the core of this rendering is this idea of the inhuman as now a new subject position of the Anthropocene that is implicated and substantiated in a long history of colonial materialisms. So this is to think in inhuman epistemologies as crucial to shaping infrastructural worlds. So in simple terms, how we narrate and use materiality changes the earth that is made. So we're talking here about an iterative earth that is being framed as the Anthropocene. So my proposition then is that architecture is at an inhuman impasse. If we say, following Black studies in the rifting of social worlds and geosocial futures, and name the Earth as such, as a rifted body, this returns a planetary imaginary of Western global world space that is full of holes, portals and potentials to rift through the very geosocial formations that colonize Earth to make new Earths. So this is both, I think, a kind of potential and a constraint. So architecture is a planetary participant, and as such a place to plot other material routes into different Earth futures. So I take my understanding of broken Earth from the ongoing work of colonial apocalypses in relation to indigenous and Black peoples, and from the African-American science fiction novelist N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. And this trilogy is set on the massive continent called the Stillness, racked by the seasons, which resemble a geomorphic climate event in the future. So Jemison explores the Earth through the lens of racial and ecological injustice, and the characters of Origins, who are mountain makers and shifters, have the ability to manipulate the geos and its thermal, kinetic, and related forms of energy to address the impending seismic events. So Origins protect the ruling race from the geologic risks and buffer the effects of the seasons. They can assess the fault lines and magma and contours and movements of the Earth. And yet they are persecuted, enslaved, and forced into brutal residential schools as proxies for the violence of the Earth. They buffer the storms of climate change. So Jemison helps us imagine how the mechanics of settling the Earth requires a racial substratum to protect whiteness from material returns of extraction, so from the violence of the Earth. So as an entry point into the current planetary condition, Broken Earth Trilogy provides a rising awareness about histories of Earth practices that need to be addressed to shift the future axis of engagement. So just as the mechanics of geosocial formations are starting to come into view in the Anthropocene and through a kind of materially informed geopolity, we should notice that these deeply rifted formations, both socially and geophysically, can be understood as rents in the material and social fabric of formations and improvisations within it. So rifting off social and material fractures and fault lines is also a possibility of this kind of spatial idea. To rift has a double meaning that conjures great subductions and new modes of experimentation. So if we stay with the double trouble of the rift methodology can be understood as a looking both ways through the fault lines of colonial materialism and a way to seek passage in and out of the underground. So I want to think with race and the vertiginous architectures of geology. And I'm interested in the relation of racialized undergrounds and the material production of ongoing architectures of modernity, and how this production of natural resources instantiates an effective architecture of violence and value. So the verticality of the city is bound up with imaginations of urbanism, but rarely does it stray to imagine the mind as materialized in the city, or the fungibility of race relations that are bound up in geology. Geology and its kin network of extraction, natural resources, architectures of geomorphic transformations, I'm thinking here of dams, river straightening, climate change, and the redistribution of geologic materials, everything from kitchen sinks to nuclear bunkers and asphalt, and the geochemical energy that distributes around the planet of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. All of these mobilize a normative mode of materiality and are regulated as such. So urbanism provides the basis of fossil-fueled transformations, forms of built environment that are reliant on fossil economies and the mining of metals and minerals. For example, diamonds from mines in South Africa are tied to the fabrication of skyscrapers in New York. Now the earth is more urban than not, and the urban is the dominant environmental form, and thus it sets the paradigmatic model. The racial conditions of extraction are organized historically and materially in hierarchies. So if we understand materiality as a colonial organization of the empirics and praxis of matter, or what I call white geology, how might we map the effective and material architectures that constitute the making of natural resources in both material, mythic, and subjective registers? So after the statues fall, how do we address the infrastructures? Or to put it another way, how might we think about an embodied geology and its spatial relations as racialized and thus a site of decolonial struggle? So that's really to conceptualize the earth and its built forms as a site of struggle in the kind of building of geologic futures. So I think we've had increasing attention towards the subsurface, undergrounds, deep time economies in materializing the city across a number of disciplines. And after a century of surface-led politics and attention, there's a kind of going under, I think, across a number of disciplines, where we look at extraction studies, black studies, human geography, also in architecture and Anthropocene studies. There's an attention to the underground as a contested state territory, but also in terms of the politics, and this is what I'm very interested in, of surfacing and narrativizing. And this comes to the fore, I think, in the environmental humanities. So if we think about the Anthropocene structures and the structures of materiality, this raises the question of how to live with a historic practice of undergrounding, of undergrounds and ungrounded people who have been displaced or violently dissuaded from their attachments to the ground by dominant colonial or neoliberal forces. So by this I mean the Anthropocene is a vertical and voluminous structure of planetary exchange, rather than organized around surface relations that have predominantly concerned social theory and questions of modernity. At the same time, the erasure of architectures of the underground above and below the ground that service the center, both as labor and materiality, establish a geologic architecture that expands spatial values that are dictated by colonial models of extraction and expansion. But aesthetics hides the hurt. The spatial differentiation established by colonial racial apartheids, the actual underground of material production, have a parallel in architectural practices that seek to erase the context of materiality and maintain its independence from its geography and the geologic circumstances of the unseen labor and the earth that it makes. So if the geos is the mutable ground of transformation in that inscription, a narration takes place within rather than backgrounded against, so not as exterior or external to kind of built forms and geologic life, then materiality is not an architectural void awaiting aesthetic narrativization. Narration has already taken place with minerals and rocks, first on cave walls, and then in and through rocks for thousands of years. Materiality is a medium of cultural and political exchange. Narration, as a built practice, is in conversation with the durational materiality of the world and its temporal occasion. And this gets kind of organized through a set of geologic practices in the late 1700s, in the origins of geology, in the mapping of paleontology or paleontology of beings in time, of stratigraphy, of the ordering the materiality of time through sequential strata, and comparative anatomy, so the ordering of bodies of species through their differentiation and material species in their racialization. So at its onset, geology is always about race and earth. Its origin story is one of the organization of bodies and beings and worlds. So if we take seriously the lasting effects of the simultaneity of exclusion from time and geography established in racialized identity as anti-blackness and settler colonialism, then this requires a fundamental rethinking of the operational zones of geology as materiality and discourses of materiality, but also the where of those operational zones of geology. So coloniality produced a particular formation of race and geology as productive, destiny, progress, socially geoengineered, and a set of earth practices that have culminated in what we now understand as the Anthropocene, and through a set of earth practices that involved the violent ending of worlds and coercion of material practices towards colonial economic extraction and botany, and also a colonial earth practice that produced other iterations of the earth and earth practices or kind of architectures as marginal. So that there's a displacement effect there in terms of the production of colonial materiality. So we can understand architecture as a geosocial formation that is both the outcome and process of materiality and is now involved in planetary forms. Alongside this historic organization of kind of geology, we can also see whiteness as a product of a history of extraction and extractive modalities. So from the theft of indigenous land and its exhaustion to the deep time subsidies of fossil fuels. And the white settler family is the stabilization force in this extreme materialism. So this kind of also organizes a mode of subjectivity which we might call inhumanism. So to tie together the inhuman and the inhumane as a product of the historical forces of subjectivity and as a proximity to immaterial materials as both extraction and geophysical shocks. So we remember here N.K. Jemison's work in terms of exposure, pollution, poisoning, and so on. So this is about both a proximity to a category and a proximity to a set of kind of environmental harms. So Inhumanism was a political geology argued by geologists such as Harvard Chair Louis Agassiz in the rendering of racialized subjectivity through accounts of deep time and geologic and geographic regionalism. So these are kind of narrative accounts of inhuman modes of subjectivity. And if we think about how these map into the Anthropocene, we might see the mine as paradigmatic, as a negative architecture of colonialism and modernity, but also a negative architecture that is built on a racial deficit. if every building is a mine, it is also a set of racialized relations, of racial urbanism that configure race, space, and place. So then we can begin to think about a negative urban dialectics, or an axis of racialized planetary form that organizes the Earth. Thus, cities become a praxis for planetary changes of state. And I'm going to kind of focus in a second on the granular geographies of Alabama. But first, to really locate these equations of the inhuman in the tying between the inhuman and the inhumane. And these return and are propagated through the geopolity of race. So here, the Dred Scott decision, the opinion of Chief Justice Tanley of the Supreme Court in 1856, gave the inhuman classification of the enslaved and formerly enslaved as a judgment in law. So through the construction of racial difference as immutable and fixed, using the language of geology and its racialization of being, dispossession was argued under the terms of natural history, collating a subterranean placement, an ontology for blackness outside of the state but within its borders. So actually within a subterranean space. So we can see how racialized materialisms fundamentally shape the categorization of inhuman nature across poetic and propertied orders and through a reliance on deep time to do racial work, which in turn promoted a normative form of geochronicity in narratives of racial life, of beings in time, which is partly stabilized in the infrastructures of built environments. So georacial codes are tied to spatial modes of dispossession and return in the neo-colonial development of natural resources as a panacea for development, so, such as in terms of African futures, for example, how natural resources are often up as the kind of remedy to new forms of futurism. So we can see extraction established a racialized geophysics in the production of urban space and its forms of segregation and stratification. So these are both internal and external to the city settlement, which is a way to think about the spatialized effects of race outside a bounded corporality or identity politics. So to think about those kind of racial dynamics within space and not necessarily organized around a body. So in this context, we might think about the mine as a paradigmatic space, and mines are negative architectures of matter that sustain surface architectures. The mine can be a detention center near the border, the late night cleaning crew, a fishing boat, a palm plantation. So extraction is all around. Yet the mine is a site that organizes surface conditions. The mine generates a set of hierarchies between what is undergrounded and what is accumulated as value on the overground, and how accumulation is managed across these differentiated states. So understanding architectures of Anthropocenic processes, there's a need to consider how these materialities and infrastructures perpetuate colonial afterlives as racialized and racist, given the organization of the material of race in a spatial form. The metabolism of natural resources in architecture can sustain an epistemic and extractive racial logic in the reproduction of racialized relations. And we can think here about what Ronaldo Walcott calls long emancipation as being maintained and reproduced through material architectures of geotrauma. And thus the materialization of race can be understood to reside in the organization of the built environment. Geotrauma is the ongoing legacy of spatial and psychic acts of violence that have geographic dimensions, so have space, such as colonial invasion, transatlantic slavery, and forms of displacement, forced migration, marginalization, and environmental racisms. So if we think about memorialization and narrativization of industrialization in the context of Birmingham, Alabama, where I've done my kind of empirical work, the city emphasizes the transformation of nature into natural resources, And the one here from the Equal Justice Initiative as a kind of retort is to address the erasure of racial terrorism and the convict lease as a form of spatial execution. So given the colonial relation to white supremacy and the theft of indigenous lands, coupled with the development of mining as a key infrastructure of colonial wealth, alongside we can also think of the plantation as a strip mine, so being part of a kind of extractive mechanism, the mine or the underground needs to be thought as a spatial model that is enabled by a racial deficit. And by this I mean the organization of racial types in hierarchies of relations that rely on spatial forms of segregation and degradation. This racial deficit creates a vertical urbanism of racialized geosocial relations. And I think the mine is paradigmatic because of what it institutes in terms of spatial and subtending relations, and what it methodologically requires in terms of a geophysical approach to race. So if we understand race as a geologic proposition, this is a way, I think, to open up the imbrication of inhuman materials and relations of extraction that go beyond place-based configurations of environmental racism. So things we might think of as sort of EJ, environmental justice issues, to think about the spatial organization of exposure to environmental harm as a historical condition and a kind of present iteration. So in Alabama, as the mines went down, the buildings went up. And the rail and power that enabled the city to emerge unearthed and undergrounded deposits of fossil fuel through convict lease labor. And one of the few remaining traces of this shadow geography is this photograph of the convict cemetery of the Pratt Coal and Coke Company that operated Pratt Mines, where the iron was mined by young black men and boys kidnapped by the state under the pretense of vagabonding geographies to racially clear social and electoral space. So incarcerated persons such as John Clark might lay here. Convicted of gaming in 1903, he was unable to pay his fine, so ended up at Sloss Sheffield Mines. He was bought from the state for £9 a month. Working off the fine for his crime was a 10-day hard labor sentence. Fees for the sheriff, deputies, and court officials that derived their wage from convict fees added an additional 104 days into the mine. A month later, according to the prison inspector's report, John Clark was dead, crushed by falling rock. So in the sparsity of these material traces, the inhuman basis of minerality obscures and overwrites more intra-subjective modes of material experience and exchange. The lives caught up in the mine and the furnace. The coal industry rapidly developed in the 19th century, spurred on by huge fortunes that were made in that other Birmingham in England. In this mimetic correspondent of the co-production of coal and empire, the colonial scape of Birmingham, England, became a model whose success was directly funded by the £20 million of compensation paid to enslavers under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. So colonial architectures have this kind of recursive geography of materiality. So if we think building on structures of property under slavery, convict lease labor extended the long arm of extraction over black subjectivity. It relocated power from the plantation master to the corporation, vis-a-vis a white judicial state, while reorganizing the terms of gender and sexuality in historic new ways. So these mineral modes of categorization of steel, iron, coal that encapsulate the inhuman are also a way of making a stable form of property for extraction, a lexicon for making non-historical objects rather than subjective registers. So while steel and iron come shiny onto the track, bodies of the incarcerated routinely disappeared into the heaps of cast-off matter at the shaft entrance. So seemingly non-resistant to their passage up the shaft through prison, minerals, metals, and fuels, materiality is made available to this really selective form of narrativization and a fantasy of elementary origin stories. And we can think here about a kind of caution to the redemptive narrativizing that has been understood as the elementary term at present, and the kind of the forms of theorizing about elementary geographies. So minerality worked in the underground is transformed into flows of social power on the surface, continuing the enduring structural relation of subterranean racial ordering. So the prism mine performed the material stratification of epistemic conditions of a liminal black understrata, a subterranean convergence of subject and material conditions. The wonders of Magic City were celebrated without mention of the persons that passed the transitional zone, the blackened strata of subjects that became the bridge to southern and national industrialization. So urbanization is a process of drawing people and materials towards and often elevating flow architectures that bifurcate, dwarf, or congeal around a geographical centering. The below-ground sites of mines, quarries, and undergrounds that bring the vertical city into being are elsewhere, obscuring the didactic relation of extraction to what is built. As the city goes up, it also flattens lives and institutes forms of precarity. In ways of displacement and disillusion, the city must go up to be recognized as such. So race became re-weaponized in the convict lease as a mean to mobilize natural resources. In 1898, Alabama obtained 73% of its total state revenue from the sale of persons coded as convicts to the mines. Tennessee Coal and Iron later became U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar company listed on the stock exchange, and it was the largest business enterprise ever launched in America. It made 30% of global production of steel and 66% of steel produced in the US. It solidified the claims to the biggest industrial revolution in the world. And convict lease labor became a way to mobilize that extraction of natural resources through the creation of a concomitant category of blackness as a parallel resource, coded as inhuman. And as many as 200,000 people were forcibly incarcerated in the making of a mineral city. So the point I really want to make here is the microspatialities of race in urban space were vertical. As the mines went down, the skyscrapers of the heaviest corner went up. And we can think about the spatial effect of both the narratives of material redemption through a kind of telos of development and modernity and the spatial architectures of the industrial city as meeting through these narrativizations of materiality. So urban planning and the maintenance of hierarchical racialized relations continue to build worlds through combined sociologies and geologies of race, as new aesthetics of steel and iron hid the hurt, telling a story of autonomous materiality and modernity. So material transformation became narrativized as an achievement of whiteness, narrating working class masculinities and the settler family. US Steel builds the nation because what would we be without it? Steel, automobiles, skyscrapers, defense structures, flat rolled shields, tin plates, tubular steel, railroad tracks, iron ore, the earthworks of settler nation. What held up also pushes down. In the materiality of settlement, coal and steel become part of the migratory possibility of white supremacy, making undergrounds that can move and grow. The projectile force of the extractive principle and its carceral logic enacting secularism by depletion. And I just want to highlight here the kind of work that is really kind of forging methodological repair around these materialisms in the kind of accounting of black life. And here I draw on the work of Clyde Woods and J.T. Rohn. And really to think about the consequences of these inhumane trajectories. In terms of, this is the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery in Alabama. And it really kind of passes a way to think about community involvement in a kind of re-inhabitation of the earth. And these are kind of jars of earth collected by community under sites where known lynchings were taking place. But it mimics the aesthetics of the very kind of geologic work that surveyors did in order to build the cities. So it gives us a kind of a parallel form of understanding these kind of earth geographies as inhabited. So I want to shift now to thinking about, as we kind of begin to conclude, architecture as a geologic praxis in the context of repair and reparation in colonial earth. And I want to move to just kind of show you some ideas from the work of the Nairobi Architects Cave Bureau, who I've been in conversation with, whose work I think really addresses the ancestral architecture of the Anthropocene. So as Strata makes urban grids, Cave Bureau consider a more earth-born architectural practice that recovers and repairs the impact of colonial architectures. They narrate and visualize, and their work, quote, addresses the anthropological and geologic context of post-colonial African city as a means to confront the challenges of our contemporary rural and urban lives. So one of their proposals is the Maasai Cow Corridor, and it's an architecture that traverses the British colonial city that was arranged around a kind of spatial apartheid of races. Their work is addressing both kind of non-human and human relations that were displaced and spatially marginalized and continue to be displaced by colonial infrastructures, as the Maasai were confined to national parks and tourist brochures. So the intervention they provides a space for repair and gives the Maasai cow geographies new futures in the city that is their ancestral home. So if we think about these kind of projects within the context of kind of discourses of Africa Rising, which is imagined through this kind of demographic model of the youngest continent and rapid urbanization, which is often articulated through neoliberal urban development and neo-colonial debt financing, we can think of this imagination as a kind of way of engaging the city as a kind of constant kind of participant and perpetuation of kind of unequal environmental effects. And I think this is where their work begins to intervene in thinking about what you do with these paths in the future and how you actually intervene in that process. So not only does decolonial architecture require the instantiation of its negative spaces, which I've been talking about, the kind of paradigm of the mind, but it also requires this destabilization of the object form of architecture and its claim to a bounded space. That is, architecture has rearranged the over and underground of the planet through a particular colonial axis of extraction. So the story of urbanism is not just one of sprawl and densities, but it's through the verticalities and depths of urban material mobilization that this earth has been built. So some of these verticalities are literal, as the mine shaft, and some of them are about the depths of subjugation and the oppressive spatial dynamics, from lack of basic water and sanitation to physical and mental misery of poverty and forms of life. So I think the practice of Cave Bureau offers a serious and sincere architecture for addressing this geo-trauma and its erasure in the urban fabric of the African city. They suggest a parallel imagined institution, the Benevolent Reparations Institute, that will provide a new imagination fund for Africa, which will attract the return of stolen wealth to the global south for the use of arts and funding of the Maasai Cow Corridor. So they say the fund will not rely on Western guilt, but will draw back from extracted wealth through a reverse pool of what they call remedial acts of reverse futurism. So critical to this architectural practice is the inclusion of the geologic as a partner in the healing. The original inhabitants of the city are restored along new cave routes to traverse, visit, vets and salt licks and follow their grazing paths along water routes. And I also want to draw attention just to collaborative work that I've been doing with colleagues, Kerry Holden, Casper Lane-Eberson, and artist Michael Sellew around planetary portals. And this work is really kind of trying to think with the portal as a kind of speculative architectural method for examining geosocial inequalities that were necessary in sustaining spatial imaginaries and dreams of empire through the kind of shadow architecture. So it tries to go in through these shadow architectures and of vertical expansion and reinstate the emergence and maintenance of extractive planetary futures through these portals. So thinking about the portal as a kind of, as a way that colonialism maintained itself, but also as a kind of possibility for rethinking the diabolical infrastructures of colonialism. So I want to really kind of end now with a set of questions and propositions for this conversation between geography and architecture, and really to think about planetary paradigms for racial equity in urbanism and what this might look like. So if we think about the language of geology, of natural resources, and how that stabilizes the material world and the operative zones of extraction and their subjective categories, we can presume that the world in which these georacial codes of values, stability, and circulation are already in process, and not as kind of not just a site of of new makings, but a site of kind of continual renewal. So the take home from this is really to think that there's no response to the environmental crisis and its architectural arrangements, and thinking here about architecture on a planetary scale, without a response to questions of racial justice, and how white supremacy and its attendant structures of kind of heteropatriarchy and class produce effectual architectures of the material world as a necropolitical relation, so through a racialized debt relation. So if we're thinking about reparative architectures, we need to think about them as situated in time as well as space. They draw on the past to map justice into the future for more livable futures. So as a geographer, I'd like to kind of think about collectively in conversation, what kind of different kinds of world making are possible if we start with racial undergrounds? So if we center racial undergrounds or uneven environmental histories as the foundational architectures of attention and see what they build rather than sort of go from the city out. So if natural resources are paradigmatic of a necropolitical relation, what responsibilities emerge in the building of worlds and the fabrication of urbanism? What if we begin our analysis of architecture through who and what is disappeared in the process of development and building? What spatialities would be needed to repair those spatial executions? So reconsidering the practice of architecture in the Anthropocene demands a new geoethics, a geoethics that acknowledges the effects of human strata in global transformation and traverses both effectual and planetary architectures. This geoethics might be understood, and I think much broadly beyond its interpretation in the geosciences, as a justice-based approach to material practices. So what does a justice-based approach to material practices look like? An ethical approach that critiques the very historic social relations and geologics of a normative and dominant form of materiality or natural resources, and considers geophysical architectures such as racism, climate change, extraction, and extinction in planetary terms that are made and manifest in urban strata. So if we think planetary architectures now form the future-orientated basis of the Earth, both through the role of the built environment, but also in metabolizing the planet through energy and materiality, they are operative nodes in a geologic exchange of depletion. So from material use, commodity chains, light, energy, water, consumption. So in considering this intra-architectural engagement with the Earth and its social geologies, we can consider geosocial architectures or already engaged in a planetary praxis. So that's really to kind of think about the kind of building space as already located in a discourse with the planet and its making. So this raises the question of how we might make paths towards spatial reparations in the architectures of materiality. And I think this is both an aesthetic project, a material project, and a set of discourses about kind of new materialisms. Thank you.
Kathryn has said she's happy to answer questions. There are students with microphones, so raise your hand if you have a question, and the microphone will come to you.
Hi, thank you for that lecture. I was really struck by the phrase "every building a mine." Mm-hmm. Not because I disagree, but because I see that. Well, I think I understand what you mean by it, but it worries me that like it excludes the possibility of a building that is not a mine. Like even looking at the cow corridor, I'm thinking, even though it addresses a series of problems, even like the construction of it could reproduce some of the relations that we just talked about. Like, so like, I'm worried that we cannot escape the building as a mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is no escape from the. But in some ways, that's the point, right? So what I'm suggesting is that you can't have a building that's not a mine. You can't, these kind of. But the very kind of discourse with a set of kind of spatial dynamics is what I'm suggesting that we kind of bring to the fore. So. Why I find kind of Cave Bureau's work so amazing is really because it starts from these conversations in caves, and it uses the architecture of the cave as a pre-colonial architecture in order to imagine what a sort of reparative architecture might look like. So it sets itself in the caves, and some of these caves were used within the kind of slave trade. And it sets about kind of community discourses within these spaces. So it carries its history into a kind of new sort of idea of a planetary future for the Anthropocene. So what I'm suggesting is that we think about these kinds of ways of mobilizing those histories in ways that become part of an aesthetic and part of a kind of, a kind of engagement with those histories of subjugation and race and so on. So I'm not saying that there is any place outside of the mine. There isn't. But some things stay buried and some things get to surface. And in those processes of surfacing, there's a politics. There's an aesthetics and political kind of set of propositions being narrated. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, it seems fairly clear how in a colonial context this kind of legacy of extraction through mining is really closely bound up to a kind of racialized theory of hierarchy. But I'm wondering in a kind of another maybe a different sort of context, like the example of Birmingham, England, thinking about the Midlands or the North and the kind of earliest extraction and the mining there. Do you think about it differently or is it the same?
I think about it as the same, actually, because there is, at that particular time, there wouldn't have been industrialization in the UK had there not been the kind of payments to enslavers for the loss of their property. And all that money actually goes into the infrastructure of industrialization, into railways, into mines, so it's the very kind of financial wealth from enslavement and its abolition that creates the context for the Industrial Revolution. And that also sets a whole kind of set of relationships in place to other kind of plantation economies.
But is the hierarchy, I mean, is the hierarchy racial in that particular context, in the Midlands or in Northern England? Like, I understand in colonial context, yes, but with the people who are actually performing the work in the mines, do you think of that as a different sort of relationship or a different legacy?
No, because I mean the sugar from plantations were kind of feeding the working class British, you know, and they were you know, the industrialization was also the kind of milling of cotton in Lancaster. So all those cities were built through those colonial relations. So, you know, they are kind of, and, you know, they're articulated by kind of black Marxists in these kind of connections, but, you know, but also trying to make kind of solidarities through these connections that are often kind of redefined through race as a way to, you know, and the same in West Virginia, in mining communities, race becomes a way to separate kind of working class communities. And so it becomes another way to sort of retool a kind of racial capitalism.
Was there a hand somewhere else?
Thank you, Kathryn, for that talk. I was wondering, you know, since you focus on the verticality and the sort of long-term extraction of inorganic minerals from the deep earth, how do you see this as different from the long-term extraction of organic materials from the topsoil, either on the actual, you know, systems of labor or their relationship to land or long-term repair?
It's an excellent question. I think as those systems of extraction become, you know, sort of more and more established in terms of kind of racial capitalism, they go deeper and deeper. And so these kind of stratas, you know, these subtending stratas of race, I think, are what enables that kind of depth model to keep kind of progressing to, you know, to kind of further and further down into kind of fossil fuels and so on. So I don't see a kind of, you know, the distinctions between the sort of organic and inorganic are always a sort of artificial product of enlightenment kind of separation. And race is actually what holds those things both together and apart. So I think race becomes this spatiality between the bios and the geos that holds it together, that allows these kind of, so you have these discourses of the inhuman that can kind of traverse across subject positions and kind of materiality. And race holds it in place. It's what allows the kind of, you know, something that is completely sort of nonsensical. The division of the sort of bios and geos is a completely nonsensical kind of proposition, in the same way that, you know, the division between nature and culture is. But at the same time, things hold these kind of propositions in place. So, but that's a really excellent question. I kind of need to think more about that kind of, that relationship in terms of kind of, it's a historic relation, but you're right that it's also kind of a negotiation. So I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Up in front here.
Thank you for your
Hi.
presentation. I noticed that you used the word Anthropocene,
Mm-hmm.
and I know there's currently a debate about whether it should be the Anthropocene or the Holocene, but the terminology itself seems to overemphasize like human mastery and seems to sometimes forget that like, technocratic governance, imperialism, colonialism is not something that all humans do. I just was curious to know what you thought about the term.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the little book that I wrote was called A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, and the kind of proposition there is like a billion or none, and that it is a kind of, I think it's a deeply problematic term, and that's why, in a sense, I use colonialism rather than the Anthropocene. But I think it's certainly a sort of term that's framing a set of debates. So in that sense, trying to critically engage that is a kind of a way of, thinking with a set of geophysical kind of earth processes and, much longer histories. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.